My name is Mark Dixon.
Thank you for joining this webinar. This webinar is sponsored. Go ahead, Mark.
No, you go ahead. I'm sorry, I jumped too quick.
Hi, Mark, whenever you're ready.
Okay, sounds great. Well, thanks everybody for coming to our webinar today. I want to thank you all for joining us. This webinar is brought to you by Illinois LEND, UIC Institute on Disability and Human Development, and the Autism Program, otherwise known as TAP of Illinois. So thank you for attending. The topic today that we'll be covering is teaching language and advanced cognitive skills with contemporary behavior analysis. And next slide, please. What I'm going to try to cover today is an overview of applied behavior analysis, often known as ABA, and to discuss the some of the challenges with the term, the confusion about what it does.
Hi, Mark. You're cutting just a little bit.
Okay. I'll proceed, and if things get bad, I will turn it over to Don.
It's clear on my end,
okay.
So go ahead.
Okay, sounds great. I'm gonna then kind of discuss what traditional applied behavior analysis was, or ABA, and some of the shortcomings that have arose from that type of an approach. Walk us through a more contemporary configuration of behavioral interventions. Introduce a couple of topics, what we call equivalence-based instruction and mindfulness-based interventions, and then describe a little bit about how you can introduce some of this into your own practices. So I think we have a lot of fun ahead of us here today, or at least I'm going to have some fun. So next slide, please. So I think one of the challenges begins with ABA in that there's a lot of different ideas and definitions of what this stuff is. Some individuals think that it's as narrow as working repetitively at a table with somebody for hours at a time. There's also this disbelief that it just works for kids with autism, that ABA is equal to punishment, that it's kind of bribing people to engage in behavior that turns them into, kind of robotic, scripted individuals. And a lot of these things are not necessarily true. They might more accurately describe poor implementation. Maybe they're just a straight misunderstanding, as well as kind of hopefully not too common, but folklore as to what this stuff called ABA actually is. Next slide. So what actually is ABA? Well, this thing called ABA is more correctly described as applied behavior analysis, which is the application of the science of human behavior. And behavior science, or the science of human behavior, has been around for well over 100 years. And the applications of these scientific discoveries, which kind of began in psychology departments all across our country, has led to interventions that are most commonly known for persons with autism. But it's not just that. It's also a set of techniques that can be used to treat gamblers, treat people with obesity problems, reduce impulsivity in kids and adults, help with behavior problems like, shopping too much, like poor sleep schedules, like improving unsafe rock climbing practices and techniques, getting people to do better on basketball teams, and so there's a wide variety of applications of the science of human behavior. And, while we're very well known for interventions in autism, there is a misunderstanding that ABA is synonymous with treatments for that population. Obviously, we do that, and we'll talk about that type of work today. But it's important to understand that these principles of human behavior are not just techniques for persons with disabilities, but rather they are kind of scientific principles that transcend any specific environment. And as a result, you may find there to be use for ABA or behavioral principles in other areas of your life and maybe the clients' lives that you work with than this kind of narrow understanding of ways to reduce problem behaviors or get young children to speak. So again, a lot of diversity here in terms of applications. And probably ones that many of you have not thought of before. Next slide, please. So when it comes to the application of what this stuff really is, we can define it probably more carefully by saying it's a set of techniques based on the science of behavior that can improve adaptive and socially important skills to assist humans across a wide, diverse range of settings, populations, and challenges that they encounter. I myself have, used these principles to, work with young kids with attention disorders, pathological gamblers to reduce their urges to gamble in the casino, farmers on improving their safe tractor driving behavior, with a car company on how to improve car sales and upsell options on new car purchases. And so I only bring that to your attention to see the wide range of the power that behavior analysis can have. And, it's the implementation and oftentimes the implementer that might do things incorrectly or in this kind of narrow, restricted way that leads to some of the misunderstandings that I highlighted in the prior slide. But it's surely not the science or a weakness in the science that yields those types of results. And in addition to like the growth and increasing of these positive kind of trajectories for people's lives, there's also oftentimes a concurrent decreasing of the kind of maladaptive or challenging things that interfere with everyday successes. So, for example, if you're a problem gambler, well, it's not just about reducing gambling, it's also about facilitating a more meaningful way to spend your time and a more financially responsible way to do it. Or if it's somebody trying to lose weight, it's not just about losing weight, it's also about eating healthy and engaging in more of an active health focused lifestyle. So there is this kind of play between strengthening one and kind of a weakening or a reduction of another part of somebody's repertoire. Next slide, please. So, when it comes to, the domain or the content area of persons with disabilities and oftentimes those individuals with autism, we see that there's a wide range of things that that ABA has been effective in helping promote. In terms of skill building, there's been great gains in the areas of language and communication, improving academics, facilitating better social and emotional kind of development and support. And we'll talk about both social, emotional, and language today in some of the work that we've been doing. And then along with language, obviously, goes functional communication and the alternative ways and means in which somebody may communicate based on their disability and their needs. And then also the behavior reductions that can currently come with replacing those maladaptive or deficits with new skills. And, this can be done in both the naturalistic and structured interventions. And, depending on the role somebody plays in the client's life, whether it be a parent or a clinician, it may kind of yield a different type of intervention structure. Where we see clients a couple times a week, we might do more intensive structured intervention in a small room, working intensely, kind of like math tutoring, while a parent or somebody that's working in the home might do a more sweeping, naturalistic kind of immersion of these ABA principles into the broader environment, given the nature of their role and where the client is at that time. Next slide, please. So traditional behavior analysis, and I guess when we talk about the definitions of these terms, traditional and contemporary, what this means is not, these things were terrible and they didn't work and we got to do new work, but rather what I like to define traditional as is things that probably most of you are familiar with that have yielded some successes, but also then to speak to contemporary or more emerging scientific discoveries and how those things might even blossom a client's repertoire even farther. So some of these common strategies, and these are things that, probably many of you do with your own kids, or with your own clients right now. And they involve things like reinforcement, this idea of differential reinforcement of replacement behaviors that's often described in a non-technical way of saying, catch them being good, reward the positive, and, kind of ignore or downplay the negatives. There's, techniques such as token boards, reinforcement, schedules, chaining small steps of larger tasks together, shaping, an unmastered performance into, over time into more effective precision, and building skills in a variety of ways with parents and caregivers and so on. And these things do work. However, next slide. There is some there are some shortcomings to the approach. One of the things that is a struggle is it seems as if most of the successes and maybe most of the emphasis in prior work in our field has been on that early age group or on individuals that are at the beginning of the learning process, where we've made great successes in moving past initial barriers with behavior problems and with communication deficits, but maybe not as much documented science on the broader and more advanced parts of somebody's repertoire. So things like, worrying about tomorrow and anxiety and perseverations on certain aspects of life and just that feeling of belonging, and these more what we might consider advanced emotional states. We don't necessarily have as much of an impact, at least the published literature, as I would think we should, as well as maybe those are why we those types of gaps and missing pieces to ABA are why some critics believe that it's there's shortcomings to the approach. Furthermore, we do have the challenge with all that, with the laundry list of things I had on the last slide as being possible intervention approaches and techniques within ABA. It's really unclear what actually was the thing that made the change happen. And so if we have multiple caregivers in multiple settings doing multiple techniques, it's kind of hard to know which was the one thing that made change happen. And as a result, there becomes many hypotheses and guesses as to which it really was. Next slide. Now, in the recent years, I'd say in the last 4 or 5 years or so, we've seen an increasing number of critics that have spoken up against ABA as being difficult, cruel, not the right thing to do in terms of intervention. And oftentimes those are reported as personal experiences on the author themselves, or from children that were, or their people's children that were treated inappropriately in intervention. And I just want to say that these are important things to pay attention to and to listen to and to hear what's going on. But I would say that these critics are more describing episodes of malpractice and episodes of incompetence rather than a description of a scientific phenomena that has failed to work. Because the science does work, it's the application of it by another human being that might be done inappropriately. Now, these are the same exact criticisms we could have of medicine, of dentistry. Now, I just went to a dentist a couple of weeks ago that said I had 12 cavities, and I went to another one because I wanted a second opinion that said I had 1 cavity. So I can't dismiss dentistry as a profession, but I rather should condemn that first dentist who wanted to give me a whole bunch of unnecessary cavities, or fillings, I should say. And so, we need to be careful in terms of, teasing apart the science and the implementation, and poor implementation does not equal poor science. Next slide. So one of the, domain areas that I believe is very important to understand, and I hope to provide you with some additional information on today, is the most optimal and effective ways to teach language and communication to persons using behavioral interventions, and some of the new things that have been coming out in the research literature. Some of this work has been done by me and my group here today, but there's a heck of a lot more individuals out there in the scientific community that are doing this work as well, that go beyond us. And what this new approach, I think, addresses are some of the limitations that this kind of traditional, drill and repeat and drill skills over and over again, that oftentimes results in memorization and really not understanding. And so, can we move towards a technology that can promote broader understanding of the world around us, and higher levels of cognition, and not just a kind of a memory of a laundry list of skills that have been taught by the implementer. Next slide. So in summary, what I present to you today is an approach that I believe is dynamic, complex, multidisciplinary, and emphasizes learning, not memorization. And again, this is not just my imaginary vision of what's happening in our field, but it really is a growing trend in the science, and it's starting to trickle now down into the practice as well of applied behavior analysis. Next. So if we take this diagram here and look at what it kind of explains, this process of teaching a new word or a new concept to somebody can take the form of what I've displayed here on the screen. On the left side, we have a picture of a frog, and maybe I'm teaching this to somebody that's never seen a frog before, and you know, a young child, somebody that's not had much experience with animals, and so I throw the flashcard up, I show it, and I say, hey, what is this? And so we might call that an antecedent, or this kind of prompt that we provide that we would hopefully result in evoking a response from the child. And so the child says frog, and that would be their behavior, and then we respond with some sort of confirmation that that's a correct response with verbal praise, like, yeah, that's right, that is a frog. Or we could put other contrived things in place, like tokens or stickers, and we work for 10 tokens, and we take a break and we do something fun. Whatever that consequence is, it doesn't, as long as it's something that's meaningful and valuable to the person. And so this is kind of the traditional way of conceptualizing a language approach, where a behavior-analytic language approach. So we have an antecedent, behavior, and a consequence. Now, it's not about a frog. It's about every single thing in the world. And it's not just about little kids. If you were going to learn Russian, I would do the exact same procedure with you as an adult. I would show an image of a frog and say, what is this? You'd say frog. I said, tell me what it is in Russian. You're like, I don't know what the heck it is in Russian. And so I would say, it's a this. I don't know what it is either, honestly. But and then you would make the echoing response. I would say, great, that's right. It is a whatever in Russian. And we would move on to the next item. And we would, start building your ability to label different things in the world around you with this antecedent behavior consequence approach. Next slide. But the challenge becomes, like, after that initial training, is it possible that all you've learned now is to label flashcards, or, we could use real objects as well, or do you have a greater understanding of frogness than just that picture? Like, do you have the ability now, without any supplemental training, to speak the utterance frog when shown something that's kind of similar to the picture that I showed you, but not really the same? Do you have the ability to select a frog from an array of other critters out there in the world? Can you find the frog out there? Or are you just able to say the word in the presence of that picture card? Do you understand the kind of features and functions of the frog? Like, it's got 4 legs, it says rivet, it eats bugs, all these neat things, characteristics of frogness. And then, do you actually know what a frog is? If I was to say, tell me about this thing here on the picture, tell me all about it. And so, again, I'm just using this as an example, and we're going to kind of expand on this example just to see the robustness of how this phenomena, what I'll speak of as relational learning, can expand upon. But I want you to just understand the basic challenge here is, can we teach somebody one kind of basic skill and get it to expand in these various ways that you see on the slide? Or are we essentially just kind of stuck with teaching all of this stuff directly? And, there's a lot to do on this slide here. That's a lot of work to get a concept of frogness. And there's a lot more important things out there in the world than frogness that we're going to need to work on. And how do you pick, and how much time do you spend on it? And, is there a better way? Because to me, this just stresses me out thinking about all the things we would have to do in order to get this level of comprehension. To somebody that has, is just really starting off with not an understanding of what this thing is. Next slide. So this, relatively new approach that kind of comes from the ABA world is described as relational learning, or learning concepts that are kind of discovered on your own rather than being taught directly by the therapist. how can we get somebody to make connections in the world based on their own prior experiences? How do you teach, logical induction and deduction to somebody? I mean, we can all kind of do that thing, but how do you start that process with somebody that doesn't have that? And perhaps it's in place to some degree with the clients you're working with. How can we use those abilities to maybe grow cognition and understanding of the world around them? Next slide. Well, this basic diagram, I believe, kind of illustrates the difference between the old way of doing stuff, that ABC thing, and a newer way of doing intervention behaviorally. So again, this is just an example. We could replace the bug with a picture of mom. We could replace it with peanut butter. We could replace it with, the entire world. It doesn't matter. It could be a chemical compound. It could be, a home address. There's anything fits into these schematics. So here what we have is on the top an image of a ladybug. And what we then have is a triangular diagram that shows what we would consider a directly trained, where we would train in the presence of a picture of a ladybug to select the text on, let's just say in front of the learner on the table, bug, B-U-G, instead of maybe P-I-G for pig or D-O-G for dog. So through a trial and error and prompting, we could get selection to the text in the presence of the picture. And then maybe in the presence of the picture, I might show this flashcard, or in the presence of the text, I'll show the flashcard and say, what is this? The child might not know how to read, has never seen this word before, and I could say the word bug. This is bugs. You say it. And we could get the response, the vocal response bug. Now, again, this could be modified for sign language or other types of adaptive ways to communicate as well. But the important thing to consider here is that we've got this picture that we can train goes to this word, and then the text word can go to the vocalization. And those two types of intervention strategies, training techniques, can yield everything you see here in these dotted arrows, which would be 4 additional ways of understanding this ladybug. So what we term a derived relation is something that the client, the child infers on their own under conditions that we probe to see if it's there. So we might say to the child, hey, which one of these is bug? And we just have an array of pictures on the table. And so now, never in their lives have they been asked that question. However, the learning history that we have established with those solid yellow arrows of picture to text and text to vocalization serve as the necessary clues for the person to cue in, like, oh, well, that one with that and that one with that, so therefore I can connect this together and solve the puzzle. And so you can see there's these 4 other dotted arrow paths here in this diagram where we can get what we would call inferential or derived learning to take place, or relational learning to take place. That doesn't necessarily require us as the caregiver to sit down and take the time to train. Now, what's important here is that, at the most basic level, it means that we can accelerate learning by 200%. I train 2 things, I get 4 of them for free, meaning that I don't need to spend time doing intervention on those other 4. That's kind of good because there's a lot of things out there in the world besides frogs and ladybugs that we got to work on. And so why not speed things up 200%? Another thing that's even more important, honestly, is how those dotted arrows, how those derivings or inferencings, how they have an effect on the overall abilities of the people you're working with. What you're doing here by kind of constructing these conditions is you're allowing that person that you're working with to self-initiate and problem solve on their own, rather than like watch you do it, you're telling them how to do it, they memorize how to do it, and they respond correctly. Here we have opportunities to teach novel inductive and deductive processing that actually has a pretty big impact on that person. Next slide, please. So what actually happens? Well, we can improve knowledge and reduce memorization. Furthermore, what I think is very important is that we can promote more intrinsic motivation, that we can get people excited about the learning process and a drive to learn and discover and solve problems on their own, rather than be kind of dependent on us as caregivers to show them the way with everything. And the truth is we can't with the entire world. At some point we need to kind of move from teaching people skills to teaching them knowledge and how to solve the challenges of the world that lie in front of them. What's also important here is that what we've seen in the scientific literature is that this type of learning activates different parts of our brains. It actually stimulates and is kind of driven by increased activation of the prefrontal cortex and language processing centers of our brains that are not necessarily active when we're being told and trained and taught what to do directly, those solid arrows on the slide. So there's actually different brain activity that goes on with those two different ways of learning. And as a result, it seems as if this relating skill set results in more improvements in a variety of global indexes of functioning capacity, and as well as challenging behaviors, and how there seems to be a relationship between your abilities to do these kind of problem-solving skills and reductions in challenging behavior. We'll show you at the end of the presentation here some data that we've gathered to illustrate just that. But before we do, there's really 6 different kind of core ways to build upon how somebody learns concepts using these relational procedures. In the diagram that I previously showed you with that ladybug, that's just one of them. And there's 5 other ones that can expand that person's knowledge accordingly. Let's take a walk through these 6 ways real briefly from my co-presenter, John, who is going to tell you about the 6 different ways that we can build skills and build a better understanding of a frog. But again, please keep in mind that this is just a frog, and anything in the world could be replaced in these diagrams. John?
Thank you, Dr. Dixon. So the very first example that is shown on the screen is kind of building upon what is shown earlier on the ladybug, of how we can use the relationship of sameness to kind of add something else on top of just teaching the child what is a concept of a frog. So for example, if I want to teach the child what does a frog say, right? Or frog says ribbit. One way to do that is to present a picture of the frog and just ask the child, what does it say? And we provide error correction procedures until the child reaches the master criteria, and then we move on. But alternatively, we can also do something else. So for example, I'm going to first provide an index card that has a sight word, frog, F-R-O-G, typed onto it. And I will first teach the child, frog is the same as a picture of the frog, so recognizing the sight word. And in the next step, I can teach the child, well, if I show you an index card that has the word frog on it, I ask you, what does it say? The child needs to respond with ribbit. And once I've taught these 2 skills, then I'm going to test to see the child can they work on their own and figure out, if I present them with a picture of the frog and they can answer the same question, what does it say correctly? So you can see, although the end result is kind of similar, by teaching it using a relational training paradigm or equivalence instruction paradigm, we have an added component of that inductive deductive reasoning behind it. And by doing that, later on I'm going to show some data that we can promote some overall global level of functioning. Next slide, please. So that's the sameness, but the world is not built around like something the same as this. The world is also built around other different relations other than sameness. So for example, the relation of different. So let's say I want to teach a child what is a frog and what is a toad. One way to do that would be I can present abundant exemplars of a picture of the frog and abundant exemplars of pictures of a toad, and then just mass trial that, right? But alternatively, what I can do is I can present a picture of a frog, ask the child, show me different. Which one is different from the sample that I'm presenting? So again, we are adding something on top of what traditionally will be based on memorization, based on mass trial. So hopefully we can hit something else in your overall cognitive abilities. Next slide, please. And other than difference, there can be opposite, right? So a frog eats bugs, and that might be something that is good for the crops for a farmer. And we also have a lot of pests in our environment, like the locust. So if I present the two pictures to the child, one is a frog, one is a locust, and I ask the child, show me the opposite of pest. Can the child figure out that, oh, a pest is something bad, so the opposite of a pest is something good, and frog is something good. Therefore, the answer to the question is I need to select the frog. And bear in mind, all these questions are untaught questions, meaning that they've never received feedbacks on these, meaning that they have to work on their own to try to solve these little puzzles, to try to figure out what the answer is, and constantly homing in the deductive and inductive reasoning. Next slide, please. And other than opposition, we can build comparison. So for example, I can let the child know that, oh, a frog is bigger than an ant and is smaller than a rock. And if I want the biggest thing in the field, what should I get? So here I'm teaching the child, oh, A is bigger than B and B is bigger than C. So what's the relationship between A and C? Which one's bigger? Or when I put all three things together, which one's the biggest and which one's the smallest? And again, comparison doesn't have to be big and small, right? It doesn't get restrained by physical properties. It can be which one is the best, which one's the worst, which one is your favorite, and which one's your least favorite, etc. So all these type of ways of relating different stimuli together and then ask the child to derivate or to come up with new relations based on previously taught relationships is the added benefit of contriving our teaching this way so that we can promote or facilitate the derivation of these relationships. Next slide, please. And we can also build hierarchy. If I taught the child that a fish can swim and the frog can swim, and I also taught the child that the chicken can walk on the land and also the frog can walk on the land, and then I can ask the question, what is something that can swim but also walk on land? So you can see when presented with this question, the learner needs to abstract something that is common within kind of two different networks. I realize, oh, frog is both something that can swim and also walk on land, so frog must be the answer. Next slide, please. And last but not the least, that one type of relation that's really important is on perspective. So for example, here on the picture, we have a girl and the chicken on the left, the wall in the middle, and the boy and the frog on the right. So I can ask, what does the boy see? So can the learner take the perspective of a boy and realize, oh, the boy sees the frog and the girl sees the chicken? And also on top of this, it's just not simple like you versus me perspective. It can be temporal, here versus there, and now versus later. So for example, oh, I see a frog yesterday and you see a chicken today. What did you see yesterday, right? And we can even make it a little crazier. Something like you see a chicken yesterday and I see a frog today. If yesterday was today and today was yesterday and I were you and you were me, what did I see yesterday? So you can see by constantly adding something else to just teaching, this is a picture of a frog. What is this? It's a frog. We have a lot of things going on top of these like discrete behaviors. That's going to hopefully create a global level of change in their functioning. Next slide, please. So again, this is kind of similar to the ladybug example that we covered earlier. So with the ladybug example, I'm teaching two relations. And based on that, and if I arrange my teaching in a particular way, I am promoting or setting up the child to derivate 4 new skills. But what if I increase the relation to 3? Let's say I teach the word sun, like the vocal word of sun is the same as the picture of the sun, and it's the same as the sight word of sun, and it's also the same as American Sign Language of sun. Then based on those 3 trained responses, the learners now set it up to derivate or come up by themselves 13 unique skills based on inferences of these relations. And as you add more to this relational network, as it gets more complex, the growth is exponential. And also bear in mind, this is just one of the 6 relations that we talked earlier. This is just a relation of sameness. We also have opposition, distinction, hierarchy, comparison, perspective, etc. And you can see there's a lot that can happen in this setting. So these all sounds great, but how does it look like in applied setting? Well, what do the data looks like? Next slide, please. So here.
Thanks, John. Let me walk us through real quickly what does this actually turn into when you do intervention this way. So my guess is that, as you saw those and heard about those diagrams, that seems like a lot of complicated, crazy stuff. And, is it worth the hurdle of maybe moving towards intervention that concentrates along these parameters? I think it does. What we have here is a study that was conducted about a year or so ago by myself and my associates, in which we identified 60 children with autism in a public school system that ranged in ages from 5 up until about 17, 18 years of age, and we randomly placed them in one of 2 groups. With the randomization, it didn't turn into 30-30, but rather we had 32 in one condition and 28 in another. And those individuals that were in our, quote, treatment group received intervention like you've been hearing about for the last 30 minutes or so that focuses on this kind of relational training, this relatively newer way of delivering ABA, while those other 28 people that were in what we would consider the control group received traditional special education services. They had a BCBA that was part of their team, and they did traditional types of interventions. What we then did was deliver interventions as these diagrams depicted, 6 hours a week on average for a period of 6 to 9 weeks. So this is a very short amount of treatment, but it was designed to see, can you get an effect quickly, and does that effect, if any, actually make any difference? And so the intervention was delivered by a variety of paraprofessionals. These would be one-on-one assistants for the child in the school system, or what are called registered behavior technicians that are assigned to the child, and school staff. Next slide. And what we see here, and I know these images are a little bit small, what we see here is a difference between these 2 groups, a difference that's kind of important. This is just a depiction of skill acquisition, like did people learn new skills? And on the left, each of these slides has, that I'm going to show you here, has on the left panel we have the treatment group, in the middle panel is the control group, and on the right panel is kind of a comparison of the two. So on the left-hand side here, what we see is a before and after image. Each one of these little dots is depicting a child, and the larger bar in the middle is the average. And so what we see here on this index of skills, which goes by the name of PCA, we see a before and after, and an average gain in the group after compared to before. We also see then in the control group, we fail to see a large difference like we do in the treatment group. However, there's a little bit of a difference, and that's probably because, these kids were in school, they were being educated, and so that's great to see, but the jump, the magnitude of the gain is clearly not as drastic. And then in the right panel here, what we have is a comparison. And so you take the before and after score, and you get a change score, meaning you take the end score and subtract out the beginning score, and so you have a different score. And so what this shows is that relational training seemed to improve skills on this assessment by approximately 20 new skills on average for the treatment group, and the control group we see an average of maybe about 3 or 4 new skills. So that's a pretty important finding. However, next slide. What's even more important is when we look at things like global functioning. And so here we have IQ change scores on relational training. We see a rise in IQ points. In the control group, we fail to see a rise in IQ, and when you look at the comparison on the right-hand side, again, we see a net gain on average of approximately 5 to 7 points in IQ. And remember, this intervention is not that long, 6 to 9 weeks, with an average of no gain in the control group. Next slide. In terms of adaptive behavior, when we have these children, children's caregivers complete the violent adaptive behavior scale, we see improvements in the treatment group. We fail to see those same improvements in the control group. Next slide. And when we look at the CARS autism symptomology screening tool, we see a reduction in autism symptomology in that treatment group compared to the control group. Again, and these are mean changes in behavior and reporting. Next slide. And then with the PDD-BI, another index, here we see, again, relative differences between the treatment and the control groups. So, what we can conclude here is that, number one, not all ABA is created equal. Number two, that these approaches tend to be, at least according to these data and other data as well, seem to be efficacious for promoting a variety of new gains in the children that we work with, not only teaching the skills that we're working on, but also teaching and improving upon more global indexes of functioning. And those are, I think, important outcomes to consider as you plan ahead. The last slide that I want to show you today describes an additional intervention or different kind of area of intervention that contemporary behavior analysts or ABA folks are diving into, and just to briefly highlight the value of mindfulness, which will be a good portion of our next webinar that we'll be talking to you about in the week ahead. So, the idea of mindfulness is not necessarily seen as synonymously necessarily with behavioral interventions, but honestly, there are some very important and interesting overlaps here, as well as applications within the behavioral community. Mindfulness is a domain area that's become very popularized the mainstream community, and so much so that it runs the risk of becoming so commercialized and so empty that the active treatment components don't necessarily work anymore. However, what we in behavioral science have been doing is to make sure that we isolate those active treatment components effectively and promote them as possible interventions for individuals with disabilities such as autism that might be able to gain greater social and emotional well-being through their adoption of such techniques. Some of the things that we've been targeting include notions of acceptance, acceptance of ability, acceptance of thoughts and worries and of challenges, and how to live a meaningful life, and the understanding that we all have to accept a variety of not so ideal circumstances that come our ways in life. Another target is self-management and learning to take responsibility, manage ourselves when it comes to our emotions, our time, our work commitments, our personal relationships, and the benefits that can come from more functional self-management. Furthermore, additional targets include things like goal setting in areas that are of value to us, that are important to us as individuals, to seek a more liberating, autonomous life, and in enjoying the present moments that are there in front of us as we sit right now, and making sure that we embrace all that life has to give us in these moments that become fleeting as time goes on. So this mindfulness approach within a behavioral framework has been pretty successful at improving the lives of school-age children, adults with disabilities, and even those of us, like me and you, that care for them. So we'll talk about this topic in more depth next week. And we have a couple minutes left before we're done that we can answer some questions. And those that can't get answered this quickly, we will respond afterwards via email. So thank you for your time today. I enjoyed presenting to you, and hopefully you had an enjoyable hour yourself.
Thank you, Dr. Dixon. So we do have a couple questions. Maybe we'll do the first question and see if we have time for the second. What is the difference between an ABA and a BCBA? And is there a face-to-face course offered or only available online?
Sure. A BCBA is a credential called a Board Certified Behavior Analyst, and that is a title that is given to somebody who has completed a master's degree that contains that's completed a master's degree, which includes a variety of courses, 7 courses, typically at a graduate level, and then a supervised field internship experience, plus taking a national credentialing exam. So that's, in most states, that's considered like the entry threshold of competency of a behavior analyst. However, there are other titles, such as what I said earlier, an RBT or a registered behavioral technician, which might be somebody that works under a BCBA, and somebody who's just like, that might just go by the term of an ABA practitioner. That's really not, that's very loosely defined, and it may be somebody that has appropriate training and experience, but it might not be as well. In the state of Illinois here, we don't have licensure of behavior analysts, and as a result, it's a little bit harder to discriminate, who has the skills necessary to solve the puzzles and problems that you might need solved. Every state that surrounds Illinois has licensure, and so the profession is a little bit more clearly defined. Illinois is moving in that direction, but it's not there yet.
Great. Thank you so much. And I wanted to let everybody know that our next webinar is next Wednesday, January 27th, from 12 to 1 on reducing challenging behavior and promoting mindfulness. Thank you again for joining us. Take care.